Today's presenter, Ryan Retzlaff, is a Senior Water Resources Project Designer with Cardno WRG in Portland in the United States. He is considered by XP Solutions to be an expert user of our software. Ryan has over 10 years of experience in the water industry, gained while working for authorities and consulting engineering firms in the United States and Australia. Ryan graduated from Oregon State University in 1998 with the BS in Environmental Science, and from Portland State in 2006 with an MS in Civil Engineering, with a speciality in water resources. Ryan has been an employee of Cardno for 8 years. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Jessica. This is a stormwater master plan development employing an integrated 1D, 2D model for the Redwood Basin in Josephine County, Oregon. The image in front of you is the kind of the finished model, and you can see the extent of the flooding across the basin. Presentation overview, I'm going to just jump through this rather quickly. So why was the project completed? I'm going to just run through the overview of the project, the 1D model development with results and findings of that 1D model, short discussion about the basics of 2D modeling for those of you that are new to 2D modeling or are unfamiliar. Then I'm going to walk through the elements of the 2D model, and specifically this 2D model and the elements that went into the development of it. And then I'm going to talk about two examples of the results for the 2D model and how in these two particular locations, how the 2D model or the 1D 2D model results really allowed us to have a much better and fuller understanding of what's happening. So this study was performed for Josephine County, Oregon. Other stakeholders included the Grants Pass Irrigation District and the City of Grants Pass, both of whom have influence within this basin. And these three entities work primarily without any agreements for stormwater. Capital improvements, management are all done independently for the most part, so it's largely inefficient, and each entity works within the basin without really coordinating with the others. The purpose of the master plan was to study the entire catchment and establish problem areas, the source of the problems, and develop a CIP or capital improvement project list to alleviate the problem areas. And the master plan was primarily focused on flooding, specifically flooding of the roadways, water quality, and habitat. Flooding became a driving factor once some initial modeling was done due to the fact that there was significant capacity problems throughout the catchment. Based on some preliminary research, we suspected this was due to the input from the city, from local stakeholders and citizens that all said there were multiple locations that flooded routinely. I apologize for this map. This was originally put together for a local presentation and doesn't zoom out quite far enough. For those of you in Australia and elsewhere, the study area here is just north of the California border with Oregon, along the west coast of North America, and this is in the southwest corner of Oregon. The study area is primarily has wet winters and dry summers, and the summers are quite warm. The Redwood Basin has roughly 6,400 acres, and the land use is mixed with forest, agriculture, low and medium density residential, some commercial, and there's one major highway running through the middle of the basin. The soils in the basin are primarily clay, but there are significant locations of sand, and the area is classified that way by the local soil agency. This aerial photo shows the overall land use for the basin, the irrigation canals, and the creeks. These are the primary elements of drainage, and the drainage in the basin is from south to north, north being at the top of your screen, and the whole basin drains into the Rogue River, which is the northern boundary. The Rogue River is water quality limited for temperature and phosphorus. It also has multiple endangered species listed for various salmon species. The canals that you see are labeled. There's two of them. These are irrigation canals, which are used primarily in the summertime to move water to what used to be a large area for farming. The canals drain or flow from right to left across your screen, and they intercept all the water as it flows to the north. So it really modifies the hydrology and hydraulics of this basin significantly. And what happens as the water moves into these canals is it's moved to the west or to the left side of your screen rather than continuing north. So the northeast corner, right where Sand Creek, the label Sand Creek is, that is mostly within the city of Grants Pass city limits, so you can see the development is much higher there. The northwest corner is primarily agriculture, a lot of hobby farms, and some light residential interspersed, and the southern half of the basin is predominantly forested with some light residential. You can see Highway 199 bisecting the basin from east to west and intersecting the canals as well. The initial model build was a 1D XP Swim model. We had not anticipated building a 2D model, so the hydrology and all of the major hydraulic elements were included within the 1D model. It was a fairly robust model, as we hadn't anticipated 2D modeling, and this was not scoped with the client. So we tried to make the model as inclusive as we could in its development. The hydrology was completed utilizing the runoff and green ant methods. 177 subcatchments were delineated, classified with soil type and all green ant parameters, which were used to input into XP. Once this was done, the model was calibrated with gauge data collected over the winter of 2010 and rain events occurring in the same year. Once the model was calibrated, historic and design events were run through the model for analysis. These are the subcatchments that were delineated. The initial run-through of this was done for the purpose of this study. We had a subsequent study for a roadway improvement, and you can see the smaller subcatchments that were delineated along the road here, if you can see my cursor. And that just added more detail to the basin delineation and more detail to the hydrology. This figure shows all the links that are used in the 1D model. This includes the irrigation canals, the creeks, the open channels, all pipes that are 12 inches or larger, roadside ditches, and culverts. And you can see the two canals that I've labeled are included, and the streams cross the canals, and in one case these structures are quite large and have a big impact on the hydrology and hydraulics of the basin. And you can see as development increases in the northeast corner, it becomes much more grid-like, as you would expect as development increases. So the image here is the spill that I was referring to, and the spill is roughly 5 feet by 5 feet, almost 2 meters by 2 meters. So once the model was run, the design storm is the 25-year, 24-hour, and we identified 55 nodes which flood. The graphical encoding tool was used to generate an image that could be shown to the client. And when this is done and you look through the output files, you can find the volume in each of these nodes. 55 nodes is not that many, but this project isn't that big, and some of these nodes flooded significant volume. So we knew we had a problem, but we didn't know, because this was a 1D model, we didn't know the spatial extent of the flooding, we didn't know the depth of the flooding, and we didn't know the overland velocity. Those are all elements that we needed to know. Also, when the water leaves a node, it's lost to the model, so you have a lot of error within your model. And we also needed to answer the simple question of where does that water go. So with not feeling very confident in our model, we went back to the client and basically suggested that we needed to do additional modeling using a 2D model. And after discussions with the client agreed that that was the direction that we needed to go, and we proceeded in that direction. These are really just general summarization of 2D modeling, and in essence it's a representation of the project topography and surface characteristics or roughness. The project area is split into a grid, and each square has an associated elevation and roughness for the cell center and cell sides. Water can move from one grid to another in any direction, and these are the really basics of 2D modeling. 2D model advantages and disadvantages. A 2D model is generally more accurate for modeling overland flood flow. Flood storage, flood fringe, and floodway are accurately depicted. In a flood scenario, a 2D model is suitable for bridges, structures, hydraulic analysis, and it provides the spatial extent of the flooding, the velocity, and depth. And what I find particularly helpful when talking with non-technical stakeholders is the picture that's provided. This can be really valuable. As compared with a 1D model, it's difficult to show people what's happening with a 1D model, and with the pictures that are generated, the images that you can provide from a 2D model, it really is a valuable tool when discussing flooding and problems with non-technical stakeholders. The disadvantage is that a large amount of data is required. Typically LiDAR is used to build your model, build your surface. Significant computational power can be needed depending on the settings that you use within your model. Significant time can be required as well. The output files from these models can be quite cumbersome. Some of them are large, so you have high storage requirements, and just moving them from place to place is difficult. And it's tough to model very large areas with a lot of accuracy or a small grid size. And this is because the models become too big, take too long to run. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the model that I built and the process that I went through to build it. Start with a georeferenced aerial. You can see this aerial has been pieced together, different quadrants, and I've overlaid the basin delineation over it. This is really valuable even when building a 2D or a 1D model, to know exactly where the elements are being placed. If you're looking at civil plans of pipe structures, culverts, with this you can place each element in its location. And also the surface built from LiDAR. If you don't have an element in the right location, you're not picking up the correct elevation. So these two elements are critical. And you can also see in this where the LiDAR was collected, a portion of this was collected specifically for this study. And because of the drainage canals, the little portion on the right side that sticks out is actually outside the natural drainage of this catchment, but because the canals wrap around that, it caught that area and brings it into the basin. And that area was was missed in the LiDAR when it was flown. Fortunately, it was not a big problem. It all drains down into the canal and wasn't a real significant problem, but it is important to note some review of the system that you intend to model should be done prior to sending a team out to collect all the data. The grid extents for the entire model, the boundary conditions, the grid extent optimization, and inactive areas are included in here. And this is very funny looking in shape because the model is pretty big. It has nearly a million cells, and each cell is 100 square feet, 10 by 10. So it took quite a while for it to run, and wherever I could minimize the amount of active area, I would speed up the model. So the boundary conditions are the red lines. That's where I have floodwater needing to exit the model via the 2D module rather than through a 1D element. And the large areas with hatches, dark blue hatches, those are inactive areas, and all the other lines are inactive areas. And the way XP models the 1D elements is to turn those cells off. So all of the lines that you see are all the 1D elements that are open channels, and I've basically digitized over these to make those cells inactive. If the cells are active, you have a duplication of the volume for those 1D elements, and in some cases those can be quite significant if you're modeling a large river, for instance. These are the land use classifications. The land use is used to associate a roughness. So for this model I had 5 different land uses. Green is all the impervious area. This is primarily roadways and parking lots. Black are the buildings, blue is water, red is open space, and white is grass or pasture. Each of these land uses have an associated roughness, a Manning's N. So as the water enters the 2D grid, it interacts with these roughness characteristics at each location that you see in this figure. And this information was brought in for the most part from a GIS database, the roadways and the buildings, for instance. The open space was delineated by myself as well as the water. The grass and pasture is the default, so that's all the areas that are not associated with a polygon. So this is the slide that really tells the story for the open channels and how the 1D and 2D models connect. You can see there are 2 nodes and a 1D link connecting those 2 nodes. The dark blue small hatch is the inactive area. So those cells are all turned off that fall under that area. The 1D 2D connection line, the pink line, connects the node to the 1D 2D interface line. The 1D 2D interface line is the dark blue line, which runs along the inactive area polygon. So the connection line provides a water surface level from the node to the interface line, which then spills out into the 2D grid. And the water can flow in either direction, from the 1D element into the 2D, or from the 2D to the 1D element. The water level is interpreted between the nodes along the interface line based on the water surface level in each node. So this is an image from my model. The 1D 2D interface lines are in light blue. The 1D 2D connection lines are purple, which are a little bit hard to see. It's where you see the orange dots. And the inactive area is the dark blue hatch. The 2D grid has 998,000 cells. Each cell is 100 square feet, and we're going to look at this area that I've circled in red. What I've shown here are the results from the 1D on the left and the 2D on the right. This particular location has over 50 million cubic feet of flooding. So we know the volume that has left that node, but we don't know where that volume goes. In model, it disappears. So we have a large continuity error as a result. But in real life, we need to know where that water goes. And the image on the right tells the story of what happens in that location. The flooding is captured and properly routed. The spatial extent, the direction, the velocity can all be determined. What also can be determined is that there's additional water coming in from upstream. You can see in the bottom of that image there's water entering the system from another location. It's clear that based on the flow vectors provided in this figure, the water hits the road and finds its way into another 1D element. This is Jack Creek here. You can see the water moving around, hitting that road, which acts a bit like a levee and moves the water into that 1D element. Likewise, the water here runs into the road, which acts again like a levee and moves the water back into the creek. Now where the road is low or the momentum of the water is too great, the water overtops the road and moves on its way. So the value here is that we really are able to understand what's happening in the basin, and in this particular case, what's happening with the water, where it's flooding, the spatial extent of the flooding, and what we want to know is, are the roads being flooded? So we can determine with confidence that the roadways are flooding. So we now know that we need to address this as part of the master plan and determine what we need to do to mitigate this roadway flooding. This is a close-up of the first image that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. And what I'd like to note when looking at this are the 1D elements are black lines. They're a little thin, so they're hard to see, but I'd like to note, following my cursor, the water floods out of this canal here, floods down into this second canal, floods that canal, and comes down, overtops this road, drains down. Now this is the location we were just looking at. So all this water drains down, perhaps enters this 1D element, then floods again, and then either flows out here, re-entering this 1D element, or entering this 1D element, finally making its way down to the Rogue River. The complexity of this flooding certainly could never be captured with a 1D model, and had we moved forward with a 1D model, we would have really missed the target in describing what's happening within this catchment. So that was a description of an open channel and how the 1D, 2D modules interact with an open channel. This graphic shows the 1D, 2D interaction with closed conduits or a closed system. So this might be used for the flooding of a storm or combined sewers, and this might be due to lack of network capacity or system defects or a blockage. You might use this when modeling the flooding of a street to determine the overland flow depth, intersections, low traps. If you have a roadway that floods, how much of that exits the right-of-way, and the transfer of flow to and from 1D can include inlet capacity. So if you have a small catch basin or an orifice, that all can be included within the model. So you can see in this graphic, water moves up and down, in and out of the 1D elements, the pipes, and across the grid, perhaps back into the 1D model at another location. So here I've compared the 1D and 2D results for a closed system. The image on the left shows the 1D results. Again, you can't really see much. You know that there is flooding based on the output files and the graphical encoding. We know that there's flooding in the area that I've circled. We can identify which node is flooding, how much is flooding. But again, that information is valuable but incomplete when we need to describe the entire basin. The figure on the right shows the flooding exits the closed system and is conveyed down the street. The water exits these two manholes, backs up, just is a little backwater eddy here, fills this up, and then finally makes its way down the street into this cul-de-sac and splits this area between these two houses, and enters these other flow paths. So again, we've seen that the 1D 2D model in this case really adds a lot of value to this model. We can see that there's multiple streets that flood, a couple of houses that are in danger, and we know where this water goes. Once it exits the 1D system, we know where it goes and potentially how we can fix that system. This is a comparison of Sand Creek, which is the major drainage that runs through the middle of this catchment. And this cross-section is just near the bottom of the basin before it enters the Rogue River. The 1D model has a water surface level of 887.78 feet. You can see that in the image on the left. And the 1D 2D model has a water surface level that is 1.14 feet higher than the 1D model. And what this tells us is that the water that left the system re-entered the system, and we have more of the water being accurately moved down the basin and into the Rogue River as compared to the 1D model. So this is a portion of the puzzle that validates the 1D 2D model. So in conclusion, the cascade effect in one case starts at the South Highline Canal and travels in and out of multiple 1D elements, jumping in and out of the 2D grid between each 1D element. This couldn't be modeled with 1D, and we simply couldn't describe this system with a 1D model, and the 1D 2D model really allows us to fully examine and have confidence in our modeling and understanding of what's happening in the catchment. The 1D model had a 34% volume loss to flooding, while the integrated 1D 2D model simulated all this flow to the Rogue River. Again, as I mentioned earlier, some of the nodes, of those 55 nodes that flooded, some of them were significant volume, and a 34% volume, so we're only capturing 66% of all the water generated in our model. That's why we went back to the client and said, this isn't accurately representing what's happening here, and we need to reevaluate our approach. So the establishment of the problem areas, sources, and development of capital improvements project list for the client was completed with confidence. And again, the presentation of a picture to stakeholders was able to be produced and really was valuable moving forward through this process and being able to share what was happening with the public and get them on board with this process. And these pictures and movies that are generated from the 1D 2D model are invaluable. So with that, I would like to conclude this. I thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.